I understand the government has introduced a bill.
Responding to Abuse and Care Legislation Amendment Bill, introduction.
That bill is set down for first reading immediately.
Mr Speaker.
Call on the Honourable Erica Stanford.
I present a legislative statement on the Responding to Abuse and Care Legislation Amendment Bill.
That legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the Parliament's website. The Honourable Erica Stanford.
I move that the Responding to Abuse and Care Legislation Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Social Services and Community Committee to consider the bill. At the appropriate time, I intend to move that the bill be reported to the House by the 14th of March 2025. Firstly, Mr Speaker, I would like to start my speech by acknowledging all of the survivors of abuse and care who have been at Parliament today and all of the other events around the country and watching online from around New Zealand and indeed around the world. November 12th will forever be a day of historical significance for New Zealand, and today the Crown formally apologised for the horrific abuse and yes, torture that took place over decades in care. Children and vulnerable adults who should have been safe and cared for were not. And many of those people have carried the scars of their time in state and faith-based care their whole lives. Some survivors did not live to hear this House state clearly and unequivocally that what happened to them was wrong and admit the failings of the state in turning a blind eye, having inadequate safeguarding and complaints processes, failing to properly investigate perpetrators of abuse, and in some instances colluding to cover up what happened or trying to prevent the truth from being told for reasons of risk, liability and reputation. Today marks both the end but also the beginning. The end of the Crown refusing to admit what happened to people in care, but the beginning of responding to the Royal Commission and what must be an ongoing and unrelenting commitment to the safeguarding and protection of children and of vulnerable adults. Because we all know that abuse is not just a historical blight on our country, but also an ongoing one. All of us in this House and in New Zealand have read too many heartbreaking reports and reviews of children and vulnerable adults who were not safe when they should have been. I'd also like to acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues in Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori for their support for the bill to have its first reading today. While there are many things that we don't agree on, I know that we have a shared desire to respond to the findings and the recommendations of the Royal Commission with the seriousness that they deserve and for children and vulnerable adults to be safe in care. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, the Minister of Internal Affairs, the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Children for their contributions. Mr Speaker, this bill is not large, but it is an important one. It demonstrates this House's commitment to change in response to the Royal Commission and that it's a priority. The bill will do 6 things. It will add requirements to the Oranga Tamariki Act to develop search plans with the children and young people in secure residential care who may be subject to searches. These plans will enable their preferences and experiences to be considered when searches are undertaken. The ability to undertake strip searches will also, importantly, be removed. It will also improve safety and well-being in Oranga Tamariki residential care so that all people can be searched for harmful items using body image scanners on entry to a secure youth justice residence. I'd like to acknowledge that the Royal Commission recommends that over time we transition to a youth justice model that avoids institutional environments. However, we know that will take time, but in the meantime, it is incumbent on us to take all possible steps to ensure that children and young people in those residences are kept safe from harm, whether that be from staff, from other young people, or from visitors. I wish that these provisions were not necessary, but it is an unfortunate truth that every week people are attempting to smuggle contraband into secure residences that could cause harm. I believe this bill strikes the right balance in strengthening the ability for oranga tamariki to identify contraband before it enters a residence, while removing the legislative provision for the harmful and unnecessary practice of strip searches. The bill will also clarify the maximum time a child or young person can be placed in secure care. As the Minister of Education, I am proposing an improved process in the Children's Act for the vetting of people seeking to work with children and young people by making provisions for New Zealand citizens or residents who have worked overseas to be required to disclose overseas convictions. Mr. Speaker, we know that it is likely a rare event that a New Zealand citizen or resident with an undisclosed overseas conviction will seek a role as a core children's worker. However, we know from the Royal Commission that there are predators who will look to find and exploit loopholes and weaknesses wherever they find them. And so if this change prevents even one person from working with children who should not, then it will have done its job. The bill also amends the Crimes Act 1961 so that a disability is included as a specific factor in the definition of a vulnerable adult. It will also improve record keeping and the ability to respond to non-compliance with the Public Records Act. I look forward to other members' contributions on these matters. My final words today are for my parliamentary colleagues on the Social Services and Community Committee. Over the last few months, I have had the privilege of engaging with some survivors of abuse and care. I have found them unfailingly to be people of great integrity, mana, grace and strength, who have been gracious to engage with me, even though many of them, all that they've ever known is being let down by the government that's supposed to have cared for them, and yet they still have taken the time to meet with me. They have shared with me confronting stories of what happened to them in care, even though at times this has cost them personally to bring up things again that have caused them great pain and trauma. They are often unflinchingly honest in their assessments of where we have failed them and where we need to do better. The survivors who choose to engage with the Select Committee process are providing us with the opportunity to demonstrate that this House means what it says when we say that their voices are needed and that they are valued. 3 months ago, this bill was just an idea. To have it before us has been a cross-parliamentary effort carried by a mutual good faith and a commitment to today's apology being accompanied by a tangible action. I now entrust it to your care, that Select Committee. Mr. Speaker, it has been an honour to take this first call today, and I commend the bill to the House.
The Honourable Carmel Cipollone.
Mr. Speaker, today I am here to speak in this first reading on the Responding to Care Legislation Amendment Bill. Given the enormity of today's kaupapa, the substance of my speech has to be what led to this bill. At the centre of that is, of course, the survivors of abuse in state and faith-based care. I want to acknowledge in each and every one of those people that is here today, those who couldn't be with us, those who will be watching from home. Acknowledging the courage that was required to share your experiences, your truth, the re-traumatising impact of having to do so, acknowledging also those that chose not to and the courage you have already demonstrated over the course of your lives, with the abuse you suffered serving as a dark backdrop to the achievements that you went on to attain and to the struggles you would have gone on to live through. Those of you who testified during the hearings did so to finally give light to your own personal experiences, to hold those to account for what they did, to hold the state, churches and faith-based organisations to account, who on far too many occasions, as well as perpetuating the abuse, ignored what was happening. You also unselfishly did this to ensure that this is never allowed to happen again. I want to pay tribute to the many survivors of abuse that didn't live long enough to bear witness to this apology. All are notable, but I want to make special reference to Sir Robert Martin. His biography, Becoming a Person, provides a graphic account of his life. He gave me a copy of this book when we were both representing at the United Nations Convention on the Rights for Disabled People. Not really gave me. He was very clear when handing me the book that despite the fact I was the minister, I needed to pay for it like everybody else. Good cop, Sir Robert. Sir Robert Martin was brain damaged at birth. He was locked away in state facilities to be cared for due to what was deemed mental deficiency. He wasn't cared for, he was abused. Sir Robert's experience is shared by far too many disabled people. Despite the most horrendous experiences as a child and young adult, Sir Robert went on to represent New Zealand on the Committee for the United Nations Convention for the Rights to Disabled People, and to be a national and international advocate for disabled people. For all those that were uplifted and put into state and faith-based care and experienced cruelty at the hands of those who were meant to care for and protect you, there have been lifelong repercussions. We cannot understate or underestimate the impact of the abuse you suffered on your wider whānau and subsequent generations of your children and grandchildren. The apology today was for them, for you also. When we began the process of this Royal Commission of Inquiry, there was much debate over whether churches and faith-based organisations should be included within the scope of the inquiry. The discussions ultimately landed at, in this instance, there being very little, if any, separation between church and state. As a New Zealand-born Pacific person, born and raised in the church, it sickens me to think that the religion that I grew up practicing sat as a front to the most evil practices of abuse against children and vulnerable adults. Those working in religious and church-based organisations who inflicted this violence and torture have brought shame on the very ideals that Jesus Christ himself espoused. But the state had a responsibility to monitor and provide assurance for the safety of children, including those that were in the care of churches and faith-based organisations, and it failed to do so. As a Pacific person, my heart breaks at the thought of that courageous first generation of Pasifika peoples who came to New Zealand, the place deemed to be the land of milk and honey, to work towards a better future for themselves and their children, only in some instances to lose custody of their children to the state, often for the most minor of infringements. I have no doubt that many of the parents and grandparents still had trust and confidence in the state and the role they would play in caring for their children. This trust and confidence was misplaced. Instead, alongside other survivors, Pasifika were physically, sexually, verbally and emotionally abused. They were also denied access to their ainga, their language and culture, and were berated for being who they were, which was beautiful te maiti of Moana Nui Akiwa. I acknowledge all of those who have spoken out. Our culture, and in our culture, we often are in a situation where we're discouraged from doing so, where we suppress these experiences that we have, where we're encouraged to get on. And so to those many Pasifika people who spoke up, I acknowledge you. Whaamoana John Luafotu is someone I have had the privilege to get to know, and all the other Pasifika peoples that shared your experiences, your truth. Thank you for your strength. Today we are proud of you, proud that you made your voices heard, speaking not only for yourselves but all other Pasifika who were unable to come forward. When reflecting as a mother and as a grandmother on the experiences of those abused, these children should be thought of as our children. And the torture, pain and violence inflicted on so many is something we could never comprehend happening to our own. So how did the state allow this to happen over the period of decades? Allowing the abuse to continue in the shadows because there simply wasn't the political courage to shine a light on the issues, perhaps out of fear that they would be too difficult to address and too expensive to respond to. The enormity of the challenge seemed to overwhelm to the point of paralysis. I do believe that there were some efforts made, but it was never, ever close to enough. Politicians got on, but now it has come to a head. Today we heard the apology from the government. Labor also apologises unreservedly. The apology won't erase the nightmares that the survivors had lived through or the nightmares they still have to contend with as a consequence of the abuse. But it is an acknowledgement of the state's role in being complicit to the abuse, and we hope provides a sense of relief, hopefully also a window of healing, and hopeful that there will be change for others. We welcome the Responding to Abuse and Care Legislation Amendment Bill, but recognise wholeheartedly that many of the survivors of abuse in state care will feel that this doesn't go far enough. Very small steps to start, but we remain hopeful that bigger strides are taken at pace to respond more fulsomely to the set of recommendations as laid out in the report, including the implementation of a new Purutumu Toro Whānui or redress system as a priority. Finally, Mr Speaker, I do want to put on record the need to acknowledge the role discrimination has played. Discrimination against Māori, Pasifika, disabled people, the poor, and our rainbow community. No one piece of legislation can address this. It is discrimination that led to the disproportionately high numbers of Māori, Pasifika, poor, disabled people and rainbow persons being put into state care in the first place. Often an assumption they couldn't be well cared for by their own whānau. Mr Speaker, a lack of willingness to provide support to whānau where there were challenges. A fundamental belief that there was something wrong with these children, vulnerable adults and their whānau, and a view that the state could do better. In some instances, ultimately the view was that it was just in everyone's best interest that they were locked away. Societal attitudes have shifted, but the discrimination still exists, and it permeates across everything when allowed to become the acceptable narrative. Government rhetoric and policy should not and cannot reflect these views, or we risk making the same mistakes that we are apologising for today. Mr Speaker, we do support this bill and commit to working with survivors and the government to respond more fulsomely to the recommendations in the report. Again, to the survivors of state abuse, we are sorry to you and your whānau that you were not given the care, safety and protection that you deserve. We must all work together to ensure that this does not continue to happen.
Chloe Swarbrick.
Secrets came to this country on the Endeavour. That's what Sarah, one of the hundreds of thousands of survivors of abuse in state and faith-based care, told me that she wanted on the public record today when I met her this morning at Pāti Māori. What Sarah meant is that the system of power and secrets, which enabled at least 250,000 morihu, pepe, tamariki and rangatahi to be abused through decades was brought to this land and established through colonisation and oppression. That is how this state was established. It shouldn't be a controversial thing to say. These are facts. As the Royal Commission into Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care details, abuse of power comes as no surprise when that power is built on domination and dehumanisation. In the official apology earlier this afternoon, the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins spoke about how the abuse, torture and neglect documented in this Royal Commission represents, and I quote, the worst of human nature. While of course I agree about the absolute evil detailed in this inquiry, the words had me reflect on Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil. The systemic abuse of at least 250,000 people in the past several decades was not only evil, but it was by definition systematic, and therefore deeply, profoundly, horrifically ordinary and banal. This abuse was not an accident, it was not a byproduct, it is woven into the fabric of the system. It is woven into power structures that ignore the cries of children. If we want to end abuse and the culture of silence that surrounds and supports it, the way that that harm compounds and grows, we have to uproot the way that power works in this country. The Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Christopher Luxon, acknowledged earlier today that this abuse, quote, changed the course of your life, and for that the government must take responsibility, end quote. Responsibility requires accountability. And one of the major components of this bill that we are debating right now, introduced to give some action to the words of this apology, removes the explicit ability for children in so-called youth justice facilities to be strip searched. It's a welcome change, but the bar, Mr. Speaker, really is that low. Just a few weeks ago, rangatahi were once again protesting on the roof of one of those youth justice facilities. It was reported that they were protesting about access to food and fresh air. And Mr. Speaker, politicians currently in power, not between 1950 and 1999, currently in power, joked about how these kids wouldn't be getting access to KFC. That is what I am talking about when I am talking about how banal all of this really is. How interwoven it is to the fabric of the state, how normalised it is. Now, Mr. Speaker, we can talk about changing the system, or we can change the system. We can tinker, or we can transform. Anything less than transformation is, as one young person put it to me, just a pastel coat of paint on the same old kid prisons. Survivors had been adamant that this abuse is not historic. It didn't start and end between 1950 and 1999. Whānau tell me, as I'm sure that they have written to all politicians in here, telling us that this abuse is happening right now. More so, the consequences of the abuse in state and faith-based care are very much still living among us. Now, when the Prime Minister talks about the government and our Parliament taking responsibility for the abuse that changed the course of survivors' lives, I ask everyone to take a second and reflect on what that really means. Because almost all of us can empathise with a 14-year-old boy who has been systematically let down and mistreated. We can understand that his behaviour is learnt as a response to a world that has put him under its heel, as lashing out against that world. But how many of us can empathise with the 40-year-old man that was once that 14-year-old boy? The man who has been in and out of institutions that have disenfranchised him since he was a young guy. The man who now sits in prison. The man who was once directly abused and tortured by the state, who now continues to be in its demonstrably neglectful, harmful care. I am talking about the brothers and mothers and fathers and sisters and cousins and friends that survivors wanted us to acknowledge and mention today, who are not acknowledged in that official apology, nor given, as I understand it, their rightful opportunity to engage with it. The abuse in state care, Mr. Speaker, has filled our prisons and grown gang numbers. That is what the state is responsible for. And taking responsibility means that we can no longer pretend that these consequences of these actions of the state are somehow natural phenomena. A criminal justice system that we all know only serves to produce more harm, more crime, and more victims didn't just happen. It is designed by people in power in this Parliament. And in 2024, it is being upheld and perpetuated by people in this Parliament. As of June 2023, around 4,500 young people are in state care in this country. Why? Well, unfortunately, actually for many of the exact same reasons documented in the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State Care. Poverty, lack of access to adequate, culturally competent services, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. These, Mr. Speaker, are not historical issues. And unfortunately, in acknowledging this truth, I'm sure that some will say that we're getting a little bit political. Everything, though, is political, because politics isn't just about political parties, it is about power and resources and who gets to make decisions that saturate and shape our daily lives. As an anonymous survivor in the Royal Commission said, and I quote, "I don't think anyone should have the power to make decisions about children that they don't love." And Mr. Speaker, this is where I see hope and love. While this bill is an important acknowledgement of the need to improve systems to reduce harm, the mahi is not done until we have overhauled the system and put an end to that harm. Fewer people being subjected to atrocity is still people being subjected to atrocity. And all of us should be brave enough to reconcile that while we individually and personally did not perpetuate any of the heinous acts and neglect documented in this Royal Commission of Inquiry, we, 123 members of Parliament, do benefit personally and individually from the system that did. We sit in the same chamber and swear the same fealty of allegiance to the same monarchy and the same system that did. So the question for all 123 parliamentarians apologising on behalf of this institution today is if we are willing to give up that power. If we are in this place simply to hold on to power or to redistribute it. Because, Mr. Speaker, the people are coming. This week, tens of thousands in the largest mobilisation that our country has seen in living memory are marching to this place to demand that we not only change, but transform this system. Demanding, as many survivors have, that we honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi me te he whakaputanga, that we ensure that our people get the systems and the services that they deserve, that we care not just in words, but in action for each other and the planet that we all share. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that the people will win, that justice will win, that love will win. In the same way that today marks an historic moment, decades in the making, our tomorrow is forged by the collective work that we do today, most fundamentally in reimagining and in practicing love. Ka whawhai tonu mātou, ake, ake, ake.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Karen Choi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I acknowledge today has been a very emotional and tiring day for many, hearing about things that have happened not only in the past, but are also spoken to continue to be happening to this day. Mr. Speaker, I was given an incredible opportunity in my life to stand in this House and be as much of a positive role model as I possibly can for a generation or generations of children who have felt the harm of the system. And I hope that this little bit of action today will show that we are serious in starting the conversation around what is next. Because an apology is one thing, but what is next is what's important. that we actually deliver real change in the space of keeping our children safe. Now, Mr. Speaker, thousands of survivors shared their experiences with the Royal Commission and have been clear that the system needs to improve its protections against abuse and neglect. The amendments that we're focusing on today with Oranga Tamariki is on secure residences operated by Oranga Tamariki, where less than 200 children and young people with the highest needs are cared for at any given time. The Royal Commission recommended that the government minimise the use of restrictive practices in care, and I agree. And there was one that I felt was inhumane and should have been gotten rid of a long time ago. So this bill will remove the authority to strip search children and young people in secure residences, eliminating one of the most restrictive powers of care in the system. The Royal Commission has also recommended that all care providers should seek the best possible understanding of the background, culture, needs and vulnerabilities of every child and young person in their care. This bill will introduce a requirement for Oranga Tamariki to develop a tailored search plan for each child or young person in the residences. This plan will ensure that their search and gender preferences are respected and will reflect their unique needs and vulnerabilities. The Royal Commission also emphasised that care safety is of paramount importance. For the 5 secure youth justice residences, I'm introducing new search provisions to reduce the risk of harmful and unauthorised items entering residences. Care experienced young people have said they support these provisions and they want their place of home to be safe. Furthermore, being and feeling safe is a precondition for the successful delivery of the therapeutic programs that will be running in these residences. The successful delivery of these programs will help young people who have offended find new goals, gain a different perspective, and return to their communities to be the best that they can be. The bill also makes a minor technical amendment regarding the minimum time a child or a young person can spend in secure care before court oversight is required to approve an extension. Mr. Speaker, I've heard from many people, especially around even having the ability for strip searches still being there, how it's humiliating, invasive, harmful to vulnerable children's not only physical health, but mental well-being. I am therefore removing that authority to conduct these strip searches, and this will not just minimise the risk, it will eliminate it completely. There are situations when it is necessary to search a young person, but these searches need to be conducted with respect and reflect the person's unique needs and vulnerabilities. I'm proposing 2 amendments to better respect the child or the young person being searched, and these amendments align with Recommendation 78 made by the Royal Commission, which is about recognising the needs and vulnerabilities of every child or young person in the care system. The first amendment will remove the requirement for pat-down searches to be undertaken by staff members of the same sex as the child. This requirement does not respect the LGBTQIA+ community and leaves staff relying on discretion when conducting searches. There will be safeguards around these preferences where there are clear risks from a preference to be searched by the person of an opposite sex. Staff members may be able to overrule the preference, but must put other safety mitigations in place if possible. The second amendment requires a search plan to be made for each child or young person in the residence that identifies their needs and preferences for how they are searched and by whom. This includes recognising the histories of trauma, Mr. Speaker, and other conditions that could negatively impact how that search is experienced. Young people's well-being needs to be put at the forefront. The safety of those in care is paramount, and the Royal Commission has recommended the government is guided by care safety principles. of which relates to mitigating risks in physical environments. Currently, the entry of harmful and unauthorised items is a risk to the safety of young people and staff in the secure youth justice residences. In the 6 months to February 2024, 390 unauthorised items were found in one secure youth justice residence alone. 14 were shanks and 21 were rocks that could immediately be used as a weapon. 160 of these unauthorised items were either vapes or illicit drugs and related items, which must have come from outside of the residence. I have been informed staff and visitors can be the source of these items. Care experienced young people have shared their concerns about the current environment in residences and the ability to keep young people safe. To reduce the risk of harmful and unauthorised items entering secure youth residences, the bill will enable searches of everyone entering the residence, including young people, visitors, staff and contractors. They will allow for the use of imaging technology scanners and more clearly define the list of harmful and unauthorised items. In general, Voice Whakaronga Mai, an advocacy group for care experienced young people, supports the extension of search powers and said the priority needs to be given to ensuring that adequate technology such as body imaging scanners are available and used to minimise the use of hands-on searches. The Oranga Tamariki Youth Advisory Group are also in favour of the standardised searches, which were not too punitive. In the words of one advisory group member, all searches should be required for anyone. This is a health and safety for everyone. I acknowledge the new search provisions may be viewed as going against the Royal Commission's recommendations to minimise and ultimately eliminate institutional practices. Moving to models of care that avoid institutional environments would take significant time to achieve and cannot be addressed through these amendments. But I expect the overall impact of these changes to be a reduction in the intrusive search practices, given the Act already enables young people to be searched within the residence. Enabling a scanner search each time they enter is a relatively small change, but one that's expected to greatly improve the safety and well-being of young people in the residence. I acknowledge most people entering residence will not have unauthorised items in their possessions, and their universal searches make people feel uncomfortable. However, we need to balance this against the severe harm that could occur if these items continue to be brought into residence. I acknowledge some family may be put off from visiting residences due to the possibility of being searched, but the greater safety for everyone is likely to mean that some other whānau may feel safer to visit. To support visitors and help prevent the loss of connection for young people that the Royal Commission highlighted, Oranga Tamariki will advise them that searches occur to detect these items, what those items are, and the consequences if found. Unauthorised items will be removed and returned to the individual when leaving residence where appropriate. This will enable visitors to make a decision about what they bring to their visits in advance, and there will also be clear safeguards in place. Mr. Speaker, there's also around clarifying the maximum time a child or young person should spend in secure care. Currently, the bill has two meanings for that. One time frame is 72 hours, which begins counting when the child or young person is first placed in secure care, and the other time frame is no more than 3 days. This amendment will clarify so that a young person will not spend longer than counting the 3 days. This is a minor amendment that will reduce the ambiguity within the Act while the government continues to respond to the Royal Commission's recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the time to be able to speak to this today, and I hope it shows that we are serious about moving forward and getting things done.
The Honourable Tracy Costello.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on this important day to speak in support of the Responding to Abuse in Care Legislation Amendment Bill. I would first like to acknowledge those in the gallery and those that met with us this morning on this important day of recognising our past, recognising our history, but hopefully acknowledging it does not define our future. I would also like to acknowledge the Minister who is leading this program of work, Minister Erica Stanford, and her commitment and her diligence and her empathy and her warmth in navigating this difficult process. We spoke earlier today in this House of love, and I can assure you that this program of work is being delivered with love. The recognition of the individual stories, the recognition of the harm, has created a pathway for us to deliver a future. It is important for us to consider at this time that this process, the environment that we stand every day, will be foreign to many in this House, Mr. Speaker, who are viewing it. It seems a cold process, it seems a very sterile process, and I hope that you can recognise that it's this process that will ensure that our decisions are made diligently, that our decisions are made with careful consideration, that there are no unintended consequences, that we know that you are heard and that our responses lead us down a pathway to a better future. The report provided 138 recommendations and 500 findings. Each of those recommendations and each of those findings, Mr. Speaker, were reflective of a story told to the Commission. Each of you as survivors, each of the survivors have a story that needs to be heard, and it is important that we note that and we allow each story to be told, and we don't make decisions on a collective basis based upon the loudest voice or the most vocal spokesperson, but those that have still remained too scared to speak will be assured that their voice will be heard as we work through this process. As Minister Stanford said in her opening address, that this is the beginning of our response, and it truly is. It is the beginning of a pathway, and what we wanted to do in this House was recognise those important key considerations that we could show that we are taking action, we are moving forward, but it is not our destination. We have so much work that we want to reflect. And as we talk about the nation we are, and we talk about the processes and how this House comes to its decisions, I think it's important to recognise that across this House are really considered, important, balanced conversations that go to informing the program of work. We are coming at this with love. We are coming at this recognising that we have a history that we hang our heads in shame about. But we cannot in this ignore those that were carers that did deliver love, that did offer a pathway out of hell, that we consider those people that did provide that support and that nourishment and that whānau that was so desperately needed. And I want to also recognise those survivors who, in the conversations that I've had the privilege to be part of, have come forward with immense strength, that are now delivering solutions, that are supporting communities. A young woman that I sat with in breakfast yesterday who is opening yet another care home to deliver those interventions. That is our pathway forward. It is not just from the government. It is how do we harness the strengths that you have demonstrated? How do we ensure that you have the pathway, that we provide the pathway to build on that strength? This piece of legislation is small in process and small in size, but massive in terms of what it represents. It represents that we are listening, we are trying to take the actions that will have impact, and we are trying to find the pathway forward on a balanced and process-driven way so that we don't miss anything. We have a history where I think we have acted at pace. We have implemented things that perhaps we didn't think about the unintended consequences. We didn't consider the communities. We stood in this house thinking we knew better. I think that is the lesson that we learn by presenting this bill today, to take the small steps to ensure we continue to keep moving forward, to protect our young people that are going into youth justice secure facilities, protecting all the young people, those that are weaker and gentler from those that are stronger and more aggressive, that we don't allow contraband and weapons to enter those facilities, that we make some clarity around the authority and responsibility, that we empower those that have the ability to do the right thing and protect them. We want to ensure that anyone who works with the care of young people is clearly, strongly and verifiably vetted so that we know they are safe to be in the positions they're in. That we recognise what vulnerability really means, and that we ensure as we move forward that that vulnerability is clearly defined so there can be no ambiguity in the future. And finally, what is most important as a former detective is knowing that the records will be clear, they will be accessible, that we make that process verified, because knowing that your story is written down and that you have access to it is critically important. That's what makes you no longer invisible. That's what protects your story and your truth. And those are the things that we know we can fix today. I want to really close, Mr. Speaker, by talking again about our past and our history. We are a complex nation, but we are a unique nation. We have formed a nation based upon a history where a range of peoples have come together. I whakapapa to both Ngāti Wai, Ngāpui and Ngāti Hau, but I also whakapapa to Ireland and to England. I want to ensure that that story we tell as we go forward does not create further division amongst our families, but it brings us together, just as has been said in this house today, with love, with respect, and with the empowerment that comes from knowing that our stories are heard and respected, that we will learn from what we've done wrong, we will look forward to the future. I commend this bill to the House, and I acknowledge the Minister Stanford for her diligent work in this program of work. Thank you.
Māoria mi mau kapakingi.
A tēnā koe te pika, tēnā tātou katoa e te whare. E pono ana me mihi ki ngā mori ko tai mai ki tēnei whare haere mai haere. Me mihi ki te mamai e ngau tunu ana i tō manawa, i tō tinana, i tō wairua. Tēnā koutou katoa. Me mihi ki te katoa e kore e tai mai, kei tērā pito o te motu, because they're likely to be on the march. Tēnā tātou. Me mihi ki ngā whānau ko riro atu ki te pō. Haere atu rā, haere atu rā, haere atu rā. Tēnā tātou katoa. Mr. Speaker, several brave survivors took to the lectern this morning in the banquet hall. They took to their feet to express their pain and their deep resentment for the harm they endured when they were meant to be loved and protected by us. Several others, seated, by the way, were even more vocal. They were vocal because what they were hearing from officials and from government wasn't resonating with them. Safe to say they didn't believe it. The fact that we might be sorry today, and I get that this is a day of apology, doesn't mean that you have to be ready to forgive us. That is your choice and your time. Just because we're sorry, kei a koutou te tikanga. Mr. Speaker, it would be too easy actually to dismiss some of the vocal, well, disruption and reasonable disruption actually in the gallery, in the banquet hall this morning. Because what they were hoping for and expecting was connection, truth and honesty. Speeches don't do that. People that speak their truth do that. So when that is occurring, survivors can tell, is that true? Should I believe you? Are you genuine in what you say? So I think those points are really relevant to this discussion, Mr. Speaker, today and for the next two readings, because in fact this is the first reading. We supported and support being a relative term in this very first reading because we acknowledge that today is a special and particular day. But certainly going forward, I think there'll be more to hear and to debate and to understand, because knowing this work as I do and as I have in my whole working life, Mr. Speaker, you've got to know it enough to understand what you're thinking about, what people have endured, and what they still endure today. And if you don't get it, you just can't write about it. You can't describe it in any piece of writing, let alone some legal speak. You just don't get it. So therefore, these are the things that I think deserve some real understanding from the whole House, to demand that the whole House understand it in a deeper way. Sorry just simply isn't enough, in my view. The bill, as it looks thus far, disappointingly, it starts off in the 3 or 4 bullet points with strip searches and restraining methods. I agree, what a low bar to start with. Because the irony is that stopping people from bringing contraband into a whare, none of that was so in all of these stories. The contraband was in the minds and the hearts of the people that were meant to love them. Not something that they brought into a whare. It was something that they already had in their minds to treat and mistreat and disregard. So it is not the reason as well that I want to speak to this point is that there are other bills that have been pushed through that are equally as harmful. Point removes 7AA. To not make that point would be me pretending that it doesn't matter in this conversation for fear of being accused as politicising. I come from a tribe that does exactly this, Mr. Speaker. So it is my point to do that. It is my party's expectation that I would make such statements. And there it is. Nō reira tātou mā. Aroha nui kia tātou. We do not commend it, but we will participate. Kia ora tātou.
Kahurangi kata.
Tēnā koe e te māngai. Tēnā koutou i te whare, tēnā koutou ki te whānau. I want to acknowledge the resilience, the strength, and the profound healing that is happening in this room and in rooms all across the motu today. The courage of those who are here and those who could not be, those who have passed, and those who never came forward, and those still suffering at the hands of the state, is immeasurable. No words can ever fully capture the depth of the systemic failures and the enduring injustices inflicted by the state. Today, when I met with survivors, I heard time and time again that an apology without action and accountability is empty and hollow. Today must be more than words alone, and this bill is just a start of the journey ahead to systemic change. Kaore mā te waha, engari mā te ringa. Today I wear a kākahu made by my mother with love and intention, each strand woven together to create a cloak which protects and holds me. Whanakitia must be seen as a living document, a taonga woven like kākahu, guiding and shaping the future of our care system. Thousands of survivors have selflessly made sacrifices, reliving their trauma in the hope of achieving a better future for our mokopuna. Reading survivor stories, I was struck by the disturbing patterns that emerged. We have failed you, and our government continues to fail you. And on behalf of the Green Party, I am deeply sorry. The time to act on your stories is now. This bill is the government's initial steps, the first strands to be woven in, recommendations, and we're committed to working across the House to further this. Some of the first strands of this included in this bill are the Crimes Act, which changes and adds disability to the vulnerable adult definition, actioning recommendation 26. Finally, amendments to the Children's Act tighten restrictions on the children's workers responding to recommendation 58. It's about keeping our kids safe. Changes to the Public Records Act improve data collection and record keeping, addressing recommendations 81 to 84. What is recorded matters and belongs to you. The Oranga Tamariki Act changes aim to make secure care residents safer, addressing recommendations 70 to 75. However, we remain deeply concerned that the provisions increasing search powers, allowing force, and retaining seclusion don't go far enough in actioning these recommendations. We are committed to supporting this bill to Select Committee so we can critically evaluate the shortcomings. Mr. Speaker, the fact that this omnibus bill, amending multiple sections at once, highlights only a fraction of the deeper, interconnected nature of abuse at the hands of the state. While this bill is a step forward, it does not go far enough. Far from it. The recommendations before us must be understood as mutually reinforcing strands, woven together like kākahu, intended to right the wrongs of the past and protect against future abuse and neglect in care. But this kākahu must be whole. Each thread, each recommendation is vital. Leaving out any part weakens the structure. One loose strand can unravel all the protection our cloak creates. We know too well that the harm done in care does not end with one individual. It ripples out, impacting whānau and spanning across generations. In the words of Sir Robert Martin, my hope is that there is an end to segregation, institutionalisation and discrimination, and that all the children of tomorrow grow up in caring, well-supported families, and that schools, communities and societies shift to be inclusive of all people.
The Honourable Louise Hubston.
Mr. Speaker, it is an honour but not a pleasure to stand in the House today in support of the Responding to Abuse in Care legislation amendment bill. I want to start by acknowledging the survivors that have joined us here in Parliament, but also that have joined this occasion in other parts of the country where they have gathered together to hear the Crown apology. I want to thank the Prime Minister and I want to thank the Leader of the Opposition for the apology that has been made today. And I want to particularly acknowledge the disproportionate number of New Zealanders, deaf and disabled New Zealanders, who were abused in care. Mr. Speaker, like many, I have read the Royal Commission in their final report. Every page was harrowing to read, and one can only imagine what those experiences were like to live. It's very clear that the state has a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable, and it's clear that we've failed in that duty, which is why we as members of Parliament have the responsibility to take action. And the speakers in the banquet hall made that very clear. Words are one thing, action is something else. Mr. Speaker, I want to particularly speak today in support of the proposed amendment to the Crimes Act, which explicitly includes disability in the definition of a vulnerable adult. The Royal Commission pointed out the lack of clarity and protection in legislation for disabled people. The proposed amendment makes explicitly clear the protection the law offers to disabled people who rely on the care of another person who cannot remove themselves from that care. I do understand that the disability community raised concerns with the Royal Commission about being defined as vulnerable, because that word very clearly does not speak to their strengths. But I do want to make it clear that this change is not about defining disabled people as vulnerable. It's about protecting people who may not be able to speak for themselves, who are experiencing abuse and neglect, and who cannot remove themselves from that care. The amendment, I want to point out, does not change the obligations on carers, household members, or staff in care settings, but makes it explicit that they are subject to the obligations and offences in the Crimes Act. This change will make it abundantly clear that those caring for disabled adults have a statutory duty towards them and can also be subject to specific offences for ill-treating them. There is never, ever an excuse for the abuse or mistreatment of disabled people. We recognise that we must and need to do more, and are working to strengthen the system that protects disabled people from abuse and neglect. I want to give one example, People for Us, which is a peer-to-peer initiative that responds to the recommendation that people in care have access to independent advocates. This is a new approach to safeguarding disabled adults who live in residential services. It will be delivered by experienced providers and staffed by disabled people. Its initial focus will be working with people at the higher risk of abuse or neglect. For example, those without family, without whānau and friends outside the service who could support them. These services are currently being established, and I understand they'll be in place in the middle of next year. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to making the care system safe for all who need it. It will take time to make the scale of changes the Royal Commission has recommended. But today we are making a start. We are making a start with the support of the other parties around the House. So with that, and this words will be followed by action, I commend this bill to the House.
The Honourable Tama Potaka.
Ka mura taku ihi, ka mura taku wehi, ka mura taku wana. Kei ngā mōrehu o te pō, haere atu rā. Kei ngā mōrehu o te rā, hoki ora mai. First and foremost, I deeply acknowledge the courage and persistence of the survivors, the mōrehu. I've been humbled to read, feel and hear the stories of horror, terror, tragedy and their near extinguishment of hope and aroha. I will remember these stories. The mamae associated with this kaupapa is tangible and we can feel it. Tukua mai he kapunga one kia hau hei tangi māku. Send me a handful of soil so that I may weep over it. Today we have heard our Prime Minister issue a public apology supported by the Right Honourable Christopher Hipkins. E mihi ana ki a rāwatahi. It's a significant milestone signalling the kāwanatanga commitment to addressing the issues that failed survivors, their whānau and their communities. I am one of several ministers who has been on the Ministerial group for the Crown response to the abuse and care inquiry supporting Minister Stanford. As the Minister of Māori Development and Whānau Ora, I am acutely conscious by the disproportionate numbers of Māori who have been and continue to be in the care of the state. This has represented yet another severely detrimental impact on the potential for strong whānau and strong communities, along with equality of opportunity that Māori in this country need today and in the future to thrive. We've heard about Māori overrepresentation in care settings, reaching up to 80% in some very dark and dank institutions. As a young man growing up in Rangitike, Lake Alice was not a place of hope, was not a place of aroha. And other institutions like Epuni, Kohitere, Kingseat, Tokanui and others were in our memory. State care environments expose tamariki, Māori and all tamariki to neglect, physical, sexual and emotional prejudice and abuse. In many instances, there was no care, and it's very hard, and I struggle to say state care, state-run institutions is how I might describe it. Tamariki and rangatahi Māori were often lost access of aspects of our marae, whānau, culture, histories, herstories and tikanga and kawa that would otherwise have helped them with whakamarumaru, whakahaumaru and protections. Further mahi will now be undertaken across the public service to address the Royal Commission's findings as set out in whanakatia. Mahi that seeks to address and redress the wrongs of the past, to ensure the safety of the current system and empower whānau, communities and I hope hapu and iwi to make our own decisions, their own decisions relating to hauora and well-being of the morehu and their whānau. To demonstrate the kāwanatanga commitment to change, we are introducing this bill, the Responding to Abuse and Care Legislation Amendment Bill, which will include a range of measures to better protect people, especially tamariki and rangatahi and taihui, in state care today and into the future. Moving forward together, we must reciprocate the trust that has been vested and placed in us by survivors when they carefully shared their whiako or their experiences, their stories, their kōrero. Every child, rangatahi, Māori, Pākehā, Pacifica, and actually all New Zealander tamariki and children need and deserve to be raised in a safe, loving home, one filled with aroha, one filled with manaakitanga, one filled with that notion of kaitiakitanga. To the kura morehu here today and others who are watching on the screens and throughout the country, e mihi ana kia koutou, no koutou te rā, mō wai mō rātou ngā kura morehu ko ngaro ki te pō, mō wai mō ngā mokapuna me ngā tamariki kei te heke mai. Mai te pō ki te ao marama, me tū kaha, me tū maia, me tū manawa nui, koutou tātou katoa i ēnei āhuatanga. Me te mō iho hoki, no te nākau i ti rawa, no te raurau i ti anoho, kia koutou e te raurau nui kei te taimai, ki te whakanui tēnei rā, engari ki te kawe mai i ngā roimata, ngā hupe me ngā mamai o tua tinitini o tua mano. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Te māngai te whare.
The Honourable Willow Jim Prime.
Tēnā koe te māngai o te whare. Te kura mōrehu, kei kunei i te rānei, ki roto i te whare pāremata, e mātakitaki mai nā mai o koutou kāinga puta noa I Aotearoa, tēnā koutou katoa, no koutou tēnei rā. E tino rongo atu ana mātou I o koutou tangi, I o koutou mamai. E tautoko ana hau pau te kaha, te whakapāhātanga a te krauna I tēnei rā, me te kōrero tautoko o Chris Hipkins I tēnei rā. E kore taia te hoki ki te whakatika I ngā he ko oti. Engari ka taia e mātou, e tātou, te whakatika ngā mahi o naia nei. Kia kauarawa anō e nei ngārara, e ngau kino, anō I tētahi, a haere ake nei. I would like to begin by acknowledging the events of this morning, the Prime Minister's apology on behalf of the Crown. And I also tautoko what Chris Hipkins said. In particular, I want to start where he ended, referring to He Māra Tipu, a garden of growth, a country where all our people can flourish, loved, cared for in their communities, enabled to share their unique talents and contribute to society in ways which are meaningful to them. This is the vision of what we all want as a country. The Royal Commission shows us we have much work to do to achieve this, and this work must start now. To quote Chris Hipkins, he says, "I acknowledge that we have enormous work to do. The inquiry and this apology must be a starting point, a point from which to embark on a pathway for us to not only right these historic wrongs, but also to fundamentally change our care system. Change so that state care is really necessary, but when it is safe and a warm space for all, as it should have been from the start." He says this is a challenge that will take time, but know that Labour is committed to it. And so with that, I welcome the Omnibus Bill. It provides just a few steps to start the journey towards addressing the harm caused and preventing it from happening in the future. The Royal Commission details multiple institutional factors that contributed to neglect and abuse in care, including inadequate, inconsistent and inaccessible standards, including the lack of commitment to human rights and te tiriti o Waitangi, and of care which were routinely breached with little consequence or accountability. People who worked with children, young people and vulnerable adults were not properly vetted, trained or supervised. There were poor employment policies, poor senior leadership and management practices, including instances where abusers with criminal convictions for sexual abuse were knowingly employed. Children, young people and vulnerable adults were often treated as things, not a person with legitimate rights, voices and needs. And there is a quote in Whanaketia where a survivor said she felt like she was treated like a thing, not a person. They were rarely asked what they thought or wanted or needed, and even if they were, what they expressed was routinely ignored. Throughout Whanaketia, the Royal Commission documented significant violations of people's privacy and rights, including inappropriate and unnecessary use of searches, the inappropriate behaviour by staff during searches. Seclusion, solitary confinement and secure care was not at a last resort to keep people safe, but wielded as a weapon to punish, humiliate and control. So the changes that these acts will help to make children, young people and vulnerable adults safer and respond to what the Royal Commission found contributed to abuse, neglect and trauma in care. While welcomed, I do wish to note that these amendments are very small steps. Ultimately, we need to fundamentally change our care system. We need to build communities where all people are cared for, regardless of their needs, and when families that need a little extra support, that they get it in their community. We know that when you connect a child with their community and build them up, you can truly turn their life around. But too often, as we heard from the Royal Commission, children, young people and vulnerable adults were taken away from their families and put in state and faith-based care just because they needed a little extra support. A house, some support to put food on the table, a different learning environment. So many reasons that could have been solved with the whānau in community. Instead, the state thought it best to rip families apart and damage people for life. And we still do that today, and it needs to stop. This will take time, but we begin now to fundamentally change our attitudes and our system of care. While I listen to the public discussion about young people who commit crimes or people who are struggling to put food on the table, I can hear reflections of what I read in whanaketia. Our wider attitudes about who is deserving of help and who isn't, who has basic human rights and who doesn't. As the Royal Commission points out, these are the conditions that allow us to other some people and treat them differently, as something other than human. This is what allowed the abuse and neglect in care to occur. If we want to change this, we have to change the way we view people who are struggling in our society. And we must be clear about the fact that abuse and neglect in care was not something that happened a long time ago, a past that we can put behind us, apologise for, and then forget and move on. It is still happening now. Last year, over 500 children were hurt in care, many of them more than once. This is simply not good enough. We have to fundamentally change the system from here on in. We must build communities of care so that people who need extra or different support, that they can get this in their community. The need for state care should be rare, but when it is needed, we must create a system that we can all trust will actually care, protect, nurture and love. And as I said, this will take time, but we must start now. And there are many things we must do to improve the well-being and safety of children and young people in the youth justice system. And this omnibus bill contributes to it. As we have heard explained by several speakers prior to me, there are amendments to the Oranga Tamariki Act, the Children's Act 2014, the Crimes Act 1961, and the Public Records Act. The searching or body scanning in youth justice facilities, at first this provision did not seem to sit comfortably with the Royal Commission's recommendations for deinstitutionalisation and the reduction of powers of the state over children and young people in care. But we understand that young people interviewed from Voice Whakarongo Mai would welcome this amendment, and so as a member of the Select Committee, I welcome submissions on this proposal. We've heard about those bringing in contraband and why those young people thought this is something that we should consider. The removal of strip searching. Removing the ability to conduct strip searches on children and young people is a powerful and positive step. And the removal of strip searches is entirely consistent with the direction of the Royal Commission's recommendations. In terms of secure care, there is a lot in the Royal Commission's report, particularly recommendation 74, that the government should prioritise and accelerate work to minimise and eliminate solitary confinement in all care settings as soon as practicable, with an emphasis on person-centred and culturally appropriate approaches to reduce the use of solitary confinement. Mr. Speaker, there is also the recommendations around vetting, which speaks to recommendations 58, 63, 64, 76, 89 to 92, 98, and in faith-based entities, recommendation 138. I look forward to hearing from the government on what the next steps are in terms of the work regarding those recommendations. Mr. Speaker, I welcome this bill being forwarded to the Social Services Select Committee, of which I am a member. I look forward to the submissions from the public so that we can work through what is being proposed in the first response to the Royal Commission apology and abuse in state care. Kia ora.
Joseph Murdy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise on what is a momentous day in the history of our nations, Mr. Speaker, and a recognition and acknowledgement of the enormous harm that's been visited on so many people over so many years. And although we cannot fix everything immediately, Mr. Speaker, I have heard from some around our communities, and in fact around the world, that the words spoken by the Prime Minister, "You are heard and you are believed," are enormously powerful. You are heard and you are believed. That is the first step, Mr. Speaker. Acknowledging and apologising for the abuse. It is unbelievable that up to 250,000 children, young people and vulnerable adults were abused in state faith-based care between 1950 and 2019. Unbelievable, but true. And today we're acknowledging that, Mr. Speaker. And why that is important, Mr. Speaker, is because the harm that was created will have reverberated through those lives, will have affected everything for those people. But not only that, Mr. Speaker, will reverberated through the foundations of our very nation. Because a nation should be measured by the way that it treats its most vulnerable, and a nation failed on that score. But now is our opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to acknowledge that failure and to make that right, and to ensure for the future that all vulnerable people, all children, all young people, all vulnerable adults will be loved and will be cared in the way that they should be, in the way that a great nation will care for those people, Mr. Speaker. And this is an opportunity for our nation. And I would thank those who have spoken for those who cannot, those who have had the courage and the resilience and the temerity to fight for this, and those who have helped them speak, those who have helped them navigate the enormously complex processes of our legal system, of our political system, to get us to this point today, so that all of those who cannot be heard have been recognised, and to give our nation that opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to make this right. And I say, Mr. Speaker, I have worked across this country in courtrooms, in prisons, as a lawyer, seeing many damaged individuals across our nation. I have worked also as a mental health advocate. I've worked as helping young people, Mr. Speaker, as a youth advocate. And I've reflected for many years on why we have so much trauma in our nation, why we have such high rates of family abuse, one of the highest rates in the OECD, the highest rates of abuse to our children, Mr. Speaker, one of the highest rates of youth suicide. And I think, Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity now as a nation to come together and to work incredibly hard, Mr. Speaker, and it will be challenging, to address those deep structural issues that we have throughout our nation, to ensure that that does not happen to those in the future. And that, Mr. Speaker, is an enormous opportunity. I thank those who have made that possible. Mr. Speaker, if I reflect on the fact that this is the last major landmass in the world that has been settled by humanity, I think that is an opportunity for us, Mr. Speaker, to reflect on that, reflect that what we do here can reverberate around not only our nation, but around the world. And I say that because I have heard from others in other parts of the globe who have heard this. You are heard and you are believed. And that is a powerful thing, Mr. Speaker. So the bill that we have before us today, Mr. Speaker, will come before the Select Committee of which I am Chair, and I look forward to hearing from those who will submit on that. I look forward to hearing the reflections that they will share with us. And I note, Mr. Speaker, this is but the first step of many steps to come. But it is an important step, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the future that we can all work towards, to making sure that we can give the love and give the care that is needed to the most vulnerable people in our nation, so that we can be the great nation that we are capable of being. With that, Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Mr. Speaker.
Call on Catherine Webb.
It's a privilege to rise in support of the Abuse in Care Legislation Amendment Bill. It is our job as politicians to give those who have no voice a voice. and this bill will go some way to legally protecting our most vulnerable. I want to firstly acknowledge the bravery of thousands of survivors, many of you here today. This is an emotional moment in New Zealand's history. Nothing we can do or say will ever make up for what you have endured. The state was supposed to care for you, but instead the most horrendous physical, emotional, mental and sexual abuse occurred. Māori, Pacific, deaf and disabled people disproportionately were victims of this horrific abuse. The state is now standing beside you and taking action. To demonstrate our commitment to change and taking action to protect our most vulnerable, the Abuse and Care Legislation Amendment Bill will include a range of measures to better protect people in state care today and into the future. The government will continue to consider the Royal Commission's recommendations carefully and respectfully. I'd like to focus on the change in this bill which will protect those with a disability. Disabled people endured some of the most horrific abuse. The Royal Commission considered the absence of disability in the Crimes Act definition of vulnerable adult to be a significant gap. It proposed that disability is explicitly included in the definition. This omnibus bill clarifies the definition of a vulnerable adult in the Crimes Act to include disabled people. Including disability in the definition of vulnerable adult will make it explicit that those caring for disabled adults owe them a statutory duty of care. Making this amendment to the Crimes Act will remove any potential perception that disabled people in care arrangements do not explicitly have protection under the Act. It will address recommendation 26 of the Royal Commission to specifically include disability within the definition. Those who cannot speak for themselves need this kind of statutory protection. I speak today from personal experience. My older brother is intellectually disabled and has never been able to talk. He's unable to stand up for himself. All my life I've been protective of him and stood up for him, standing up for him when he was teased at school, standing up for him when he was mistreated. But as family members, we can't always be there to stand up for them. So we put trust in others, and that trust should be respected and upheld. But that was not always the case for our family. And the hardest thing when that trust has been breached is that they can't tell you. They can't speak up for themselves. So wrongs are silenced. Through my brother's life, he's had many carers, and one carer in particular was with him for over a decade. She was the most incredible woman, for who our family will be forever grateful. She showed so much love and compassion and treated our brother like her own. When we put our most vulnerable into care, we expect this, and we expect they will be cared for with some love and with aroha. As mothers, we have that natural instinct to protect our babies. I would like to acknowledge a survivor whose story touched my heart and whose advocacy for disabled people across Aotearoa has been significantly recognised. And has already been mentioned today, Sir Robert Martin, who was a survivor with a disability. He passed away earlier this year. He endured horrific state abuse at the Kimberley Centre, and in his story he said, "I'm a person first, disability second." He shared a heartbreaking truth. When you are shut away from the world, you are not treated as a real person with a life that actually matters. He said, "I don't want disabled children to have the same childhood I did. Out of sight, out of mind is no longer acceptable." As a government, we can't control human nature. We can't fully control human behaviour, but we can control the protections and rights of our most vulnerable and ensure those who offend are legally accountable. As a politician, I stand up for survivors like Sir Robert Martin and his family and our disabled community. As a sister, I stand up for my disabled brother, And for those who don't have a voice, we need to give you a voice and the protection you deserve. I commend this bill to the House.
The Right Honourable Adjourn Ruarafe.
Tēnā koe te maanga e te hare o te rā kia koutou ngā mōrehu putunua Aotearoa tai atu ki te whare nei, tēnei te mihi ake kia koutou, tēnā koutou. Mr. Speaker, yesterday morning I attended the blessing and opening of an art exhibition of artwork by survivors of abuse and care. One of the pieces struck me when I saw it. It had 2 words on it, Ngāti Whāngai. It was a beautiful piece. Whāngai is a kaupapa Māori. It's a kaupapa that's been practiced in my family, my whānau, for many generations, practiced successfully. The artwork both troubled me and challenged me. I've been thinking about it a lot since I saw it. And whāngai to me means nurturing children that are not able, for whatever reason, to be able to be raised by their birth parents. It told me that the artist had expectations about their care that were not met. It told me that as a state, we haven't met those expectations that we should have. It told me that there is value in kaupapa Māori. It told me that kaupapa Māori such as whāngai should be respected because those who impacts on would be better off under that kind of kaupapa, because there has been generations of practice to prove that. But too often, Mr. Speaker, such kaupapa have been characterised as being race-based systems by this very House. I think it's time for us to stop trying to maintain a way forward under a system that clearly does not work. Tinkering around the edges will not work. It will not work for Māori, will not work for Pacifica, it will not work for Pākehā. What we have seen through this report and what we see in this bill is not even Kiwi. And that's something that we all should apologise for. But I say to this House, as I said before, there's value in kaupapa Māori and it needs to be empowered to give it a shot, to give it a go, to let it work. And it's actually not difficult. And that is my main message to this House. I'm not going to speak for very long. It's not my voice that needs to be heard in this whare, it's others. And to the kura mōrehu, I say to you, kia kaha, kia ora.
Catherine Wedd. Katie Nimmin.
Mr. Speaker, I want to start by acknowledging the survivors, those who have been here with us today and those that couldn't be. Thank you for your bravery in this process. I know that this legislation wouldn't be making the changes it is without your courage to share your experiences, and of course through the select committee process that can and will continue. I'm here to speak in support of the Responding to Abuse and Care Legislation Amendment Bill. This omnibus bill represents a key step forward to ensuring the safety, dignity and well-being of children, young people and vulnerable adults in our care system. Through this legislation, we are acting on the recommendations of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Historical Abuse in state and faith-based care institutions. This bill is not just focusing on one area of change, nor did the inquiry. As we've heard, 138 recommendations, 28 of which have either been completed or started already. There are 4 acts that need amending to implement changes in step with our initial response. An omnibus bill allows us to introduce simultaneous changes across several key pieces of legislation. In this case, Oranga Tamariki Act 1989, the Children's Act 2014, the Crimes Act 1961, and the Public Records Act 2005. Each of these amendments aims to strengthen protections, enhance accountability, clarify the processes involved in providing care, and legislative changes being combined into an omnibus bill allow us to truly drive positive change in the care system at pace. To break down the 4 changes across the different acts, or the changes, sorry, across the 4 different acts, as we've heard, the amendments to the Oranga Tamariki Act, in particular, the way that searches are done to keep those staying in care residences, youth justice facilities safe. The amendments to the Children's Act, expanding workforce restrictions, especially those that have had offences abroad or crimes under the Prostitution Reform Act involving minors. To acknowledge my experience in my former jobs with the Vulnerable Children's Act, acknowledging that this only seeks to find those that have been convicted, and that there are many that offend that haven't yet been convicted, and that is a challenge that we still will face in the future. The bill obviously also amends the Crimes Act, defining vulnerable adult, and as well, finally, the amendments to the Public Records Act to enhance the ability of Archives New Zealand to audit agencies more frequently, to be watched and to be ensured that nothing is being brushed under the carpet is a very important factor. If we introduced these changes as 4 different amendment bills, it would slow the pace of change, it would draw out the process of public consultation, and would add further trauma to those sharing their experiences to help us ensure that this is the best possible legislation. Because that is the process we go through when we go through Select Committee, is to hear from people, to make sure that what we're proposing is right and that people's voices are heard. To do this as an omnibus bill helps us combine these through a common thread to ensure the safety and protection of vulnerable children in state care. Instead of the Social Services and Community Select Committee, the Governance and Administration Select Committee and the Justice Select Committees going through these processes in parallel, we can combine these changes and make sure that we are looking at these as a response to the inquiry legislation amendment. And while I've talked about the importance of this being an omnibus bill, it's important for me to mention that it's more than just a collection of technical changes. It's a shift towards a more compassionate and vigilant care system. By making these amendments, we send a clear message that abuse and neglect in any form have no place in our care systems. These protections need to reinforce public trust in our care institutions. Fundamentally, that is what has been broken. Mr. Speaker, the Responding to Abuse and Care Legislation Amendment Bill is an essential step in reforming our care systems and rectifying past failures, but this is not the only thing that we must do. This is just the beginning. I just want to acknowledge earlier the creation of a memorial or remembrance day next year on the 12th of November, a moment for us to keep reflecting that we have made progress and will continue to make progress, the progress that the people that have gone through this, the survivors, expect. And so I look forward to us marking progress. We've talked about 28 of these things. I look forward to achieving more and more as we go on. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Call on Glenn Bennett.
It takes a village to raise a child. That's the proverb that we know and that we love. But this village has failed that child. This village has let that child down. This village has hurt and traumatised that child. And this village should be ashamed of itself. This village needs to right the wrongs, to say sorry, to do everything that it can to seek forgiveness, to create strong protections and laws to protect that child. It takes a village to raise a child, And that child, the survivors, those who've been in state and faith-based care, have fought and have shouted for far too long for today to come. It takes a village to raise a child, and that child, those survivors, need to be acknowledged, need to be believed. But what they've done in the process of fighting for their voices is they've flipped this proverb on its head. It takes a child to remind us of our responsibility to the village. And as you shouted and as you fought and as you were ignored, you reminded us today and in the past recent years with the Royal Commission what our responsibility is to the village. It takes a child to remind us of our responsibility to the village. And who am I? What am I doing here today, standing, speaking to this bill? White, cisgendered, a middle-aged male. But I'm also a Christian who grew up in the church in the Salvation Army. I'm also a caregiver who's spent more than 20 years working alongside the state system, caring for our most vulnerable in my home. I'm also gay and a member of our rainbow whānau, and personally have memories of prejudice, memories of treatment that society put upon me, but also that the church did, and we should be ashamed of ourselves. So my story is not your story, but I want to stand up and be part of being a voice for our future. And as I look at our rainbow whānau, as I look at our Takatapui community, at our LGBTIQ plus whānau, the hurt and the harm that was inflicted on our community in state and faith-based care is appalling. Because of the intolerance of society, because of heteronormative cultures, because of misplaced beliefs and scriptures that were written 3,000 years ago in different cultures and time, all of these factors are not your fault. You are beautiful and you are wonderfully made. And it's a system that is ugly. It is bad religious dogma that is rotten to the core. And when the state and faith-based organisations got away with the horrors that they did, we need to step up as a village and take responsibility. If you look in the Borstals and the foster home and the institutions and the faith-based care homes, the psychiatric wards, they cause more trauma and abuse than you needed from the start. The experiments to cure you, the experiments to fix you was something that you never asked for, something that was unnecessary, that didn't need to be fixed. And as for the church organisations, they should have known better if they'd read the book that their faith is founded on. So can I just say to our rainbow survivors with us today, you are perfect, you are beautiful, you are fabulous. I'm also a caregiver, and for more than 20 years have been taking young people into my home who the state was responsible to care for. And one of these young people came into my care at age 11. He had seen things no 11-year-old ever should have seen, through no fault of his own, into the whānau he was born into. They were unable to care for him. And so the state stepped in and took him on. And that began a course of abuse, of neglect, of shaming, and it is shameful. And when he came to stay with me at age 11, he had lived a full life that no one ever should have had to live. And as has been spoken about earlier, that was a pathway for him to go to prison. And in many ways it was destined because of the way the state treated him, the way the state had treated his family, what the state allowed to happen to him. And we should be ashamed of ourselves. Then there's a 14-year-old who came to live with me, who had many an issue, an alcoholic father, and trauma had gone on long before he came into my care. And one day I picked up his dad and was dropping him home from the supermarket. And he wasn't a chatty person, he never really engaged. But on this day, we got talking. And he told me about the fact that when he was a child, he was sent to Oamaru, to Borstal down there, from Aotearoa. He was completely severed and disconnected from his family, from his whānau, from his whakapapa, and put down in Oamaru on another complete island, in fact, on another complete world, Mr. Speaker. So do I blame the 14-year-old who came into my care for the misdemeanours and things he did? Do I blame his father for becoming an alcoholic? No, Mr. Speaker. It's the system and the state that we must fix. And then there's my mate Roger. Sadly, Roger passed away last year, but he'd been a friend I met 30 years ago when I was working at the Salvation Army. He had polio in the 1950s as a child, as a baby, ended up with a major disfigurement and unable to walk properly. And as a pre-teen, doctors, the state, said, you need to put him into Pāti Hospital. That is the best thing for him. And Roger spent the next 25 plus years in Pāti Hospital. Why? Because he had a limp. Because he had a limp. And the treatment of him was shameful and shocking. So I'm glad that in this piece of legislation, we're looking at including disability in this to make sure it comes in line with the Royal Commission report to ensure that our disability communities are acknowledged. Mr. Speaker, this morning we apologised. This afternoon we continue that, but I believe this has to be a line in the sand. How do we move forward? How do we look forward together as a village? How do we turn these words into action? How do we ensure that we get this legislation right, that we pull it to pieces, that we put it back together, that this is just the start of what is to come to make sure that our village thrives and that our children are who they should be and who they are destined to be. I speak today on behalf of the young people I've looked after in the hope that the work that we do in this house will ensure changes are made so that they can look at me in the eye and say, Koro Glen, our babies are going to be okay. Our babies are going to be okay. Mr. Speaker, it takes a child to remind us our responsibility to the village. We're meant to protect our babies. We're meant to nurture our babies. We are meant to love our babies. And I challenge all sides of this house to do everything we can to make sure that we adhere to our responsibilities and obligations to our village.
Dan Pidwa.
E te manga o te whare. Ina mana, ina reo, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. There is a lot of power in sharing a story, said survivor Rupene Amato. Thank you for sharing your stories with us today and through this inquiry. Whether you are here in the gallery and spoke this morning, or whether you are tuning in online around the country, we all here today acknowledge that sharing your story required great courage, vulnerability, the grit to confront the past so that the future can look brighter for you and many more. So thank you, thank you, thank you. This is an historic and important day after a 6-year-long inquiry of state abuse that goes as far back to the 1950s and still continues to this very day. Abuse in state care and faith-based institutions. Today, Mr. Speaker, is about accountability. It is about responsibility. It is about your voices being heard, about the abuse that you faced, the effects it had on your life, and the loss of potential in what could have been. It is about, Mr. Speaker, the mamae after all these years of finally being acknowledged. And it is about the apology, and I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful apologies from both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. Today also, Mr. Speaker, is about action, because after all, that is what survivors up and down this country wish to see. And action is coming in the form of two ways. The first is this omnibus bill which we are discussing today. The second is the redress. And I acknowledge, and many will do here, that survivors wanted the redress yesterday, not tomorrow. But I also acknowledge that it is extremely complex and it will take time to get this redress right. And the honest truth, as the Prime Minister said before, Mr. Speaker, is that no amount of redress makes this okay or justifies the abuse and the mamae that survivors experienced. And also, as the Leader of the Opposition said, the redress, when it does come, will be a big bill, but it will be small in comparison to those that is deserved. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is really about starting this process. It is about making changes to 4 pieces of legislation, as has been covered today. Making changes to the Oranga Tamariki Act to amend the requirements for search and to improve the safety of well-being of people in residential care. The Children's Act, changes to this Act to ensure that those with overseas qualifications convictions cannot work with children in state care. The third bill is the Crimes Act to ensure that those with a disability is included in the definition of a vulnerable adult. And finally, changes to the Public Records Act to improve once and for all the record-keeping practices in this country. Mr. Speaker, today is a start, but as has been signalled, there is a long road ahead on this journey together. And as survivor, Mr. NM said, having kids, my daughter and sons, that kind of steered me away onto a better path, but I'm still trying to find that direction and guidance. A lot of times it comes back to what happened to me in care, and I know I need to be proactive and positive. What have I got to share? It can make a big difference on a lot of others. It is just about moving forward, and we all move forward together. I know it's still a long way to go. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koutou, Patrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is an historic day, one we will remember for years to come, but it is just the start. Firstly, may I acknowledge all the survivors in whānau here today, or those who are watching from afar. Today is another step in the long and arduous journey that you have been on for many years now. To the survivors, your courage and determination to fight for justice and redress has been heard and believed. Your stories are harrowing, heartbreaking, emotional and confronting. As we heard the apology here today, the raw emotion was evident among you. To those who have come from the East Coast and all over the country, and to those who fought for this day but have passed, I hope this will be a step towards further change that will see a system that never treats people in this country like this ever again. It's an honour to be the final speaker today on the first reading of this legislation, which begins the steps for change for 138 recommendations. Mr Speaker, my colleagues across the House have covered many parts of the omnibus legislation today, but I want to finish this with the changes outlined for the Public Records Act. On the face of it, maybe not the most dramatic part of what's happened, but for one moment, can we just reflect on the trauma that people went through? Firstly, at the hands of the most hideous of perpetrators, only for those survivors and their whānau to do their best to survive a life forever shaped by trauma, torture, sexual assault, mental health issues, self-doubt and worthlessness. To then gather the courage to request their records so they could reconcile what happened to them, only to find that much of what they knew in their hearts and minds didn't exist in the records. This then meant there was no evidence for redress, for criminal actions or to get help through ACC, medical professionals or others, which exacerbated the trauma further and only reignited long-held feelings of despair. Survivor Beverly Wardle Jackson wrote a book titled In the Hands of Strangers. Beverly requested her files from Child Welfare, and in her words, as I read the notes that had been recorded about me, I wept. Shock, anger and feelings of worthlessness welled up inside me. I could hardly believe the cover-ups, whispers and lies people had written to justify their treatment of me. As if they had not endured enough, survivors have consistently highlighted the high value they placed on accessing their records. They fill important gaps in what they know about why they were in care and what happened to them whilst they were there. But so many barriers, limited guidance on how to access records. They were spread across numerous agencies, some of which don't exist anymore. Institutions sometimes couldn't find the records, some took an unreasonable length of time to find them, and many were hidden or destroyed. And in the records that did exist, they often had the wrong names, dates or details. One survivor said the lack of proper record keeping has been one of the most difficult parts of this process. It undermines a system of redress if no accurate records are kept, and it makes the whole process stressful. It also made it difficult, as I've said, to provide evidence required to take claims seriously. The barriers to accessing records fundamentally affected survivors' ability to heal. Limited records affect their ability to claim redress, but also bar survivors from understanding their own experiences and the abuse, harm and trauma they experienced. In the words of one, the records I received through my OIA request are very valuable to me. Other children have photos. All I have is records. Mr Speaker, this part of the Omnibus Bill sets out the changes that need to be made to the Public Records Act 2004 to ensure we do better. Survivors have repeatedly stated that for an apology to be meaningful, it needs to be accompanied by commitments to action, and this bill demonstrates our commitment and signals the start of legislative change in response to the Royal Commission. This is just a first step. As a government, we will do everything in our power to prevent abuse from occurring in the future, because this is the legacy that we owe to survivors. I'd like to acknowledge the coalition partners and the opposition parties for their support in progressing this bill, and the changes in this omnibus bill will drive change in the Oranga Tamariki Act, the Children's Act, the Crimes Act and the Records Act. I want to acknowledge the Honourable Erica Stanford and her team, including other ministers, for beginning this work and ensuring people are heard and valued along the way, as well as all of those who are involved in the Royal Commission of Inquiry. Mr Speaker, as I thank the survivors one more time for their courage and tolerance, I note that across the House we all commit to working together and to a point where, for the sake of our children, we can all commend this bill to the House. Thank you.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Responding to Abuse in Care Legislation Amendment Bill, first reading.
The question is that the Responding to Abuse in Care Legislation Amendment Bill be considered by the Social Services Select Committee. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The Honourable Erica Stanford.
Speaker, I move that the Responding to Abuse in Care Legislation Amendment Bill be reported to the House by 14th of March 2025.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. Call on the Honourable Simeon Brown.
I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.